So I'm going to start by reviewing some things that a lot of us are aware of, which is that the United States is becoming more diverse, and this process has been underway for some time now. So the most recent projections from the U.S. Census Bureau put whites as a minority of the U.S. population sometime in the 2040s or the 2050s. Every other major racial or ethnic groups, Latinos, Blacks, and Asians, is expected to continue growing through a combination of immigration and high birth rates. In fact, today, particularly for Latinos, birth rates account for a lot of the story. So at last count, 13.4% of people living in the United States were born abroad. But immigration has been slowing since the year 2000, and especially since the recession. So in some cases, for example, in the case of immigration from Mexico, immigration has stalled and even reversed. So net migration from Mexico is currently negative. Donald Trump is trying to take credit for this. He's been citing lower apprehension figures at the U.S.-Mexico border in 2016 as evidence that his policies or his persona are already working, but in fact, it's too early to tell, and we do know that decreasing migration from Mexico is certainly a trend that predates his election. One interesting aspect of recent migration to the United States is that it's shifted away from what are known as traditional gateways of migration. So even though immigrants today still tend to be concentrated in gateway states like California, Texas, Florida, New York, and New Jersey, the pattern of migration is shifting more towards locations in the Southeast and Midwest. And this is important because a lot of research on intergroup relations, particularly from social psychology, tells us that it's not just about the size of a minority group, it's actually about the growth, about demographic changes that can be particularly threatening, particularly for members of the dominant group. So if we look at growth in the migrant population in U.S. counties, here we have a measure that captures the size of the migrant population around the year 2012 relative to the size in 2000 for different counties in the United States. And we can get a sense of where migration, where the immigrant population was growing relative to the size that it was initially. And these are places, in many cases, that had small or very, historically recent migration flows, right? And these patterns are more diffuse, right? They're not concentrated in California and Texas. In fact, if there's any sort of pattern that we can discern, it's that counties in the Southeast and the Midwest are experiencing substantial diversification. In fact, the counties where the Latino population is growing the fastest in the United States today are North Dakota and North Carolina. So how do U.S.-born Americans view these changes? So these patterns have spawned a really interesting line of work on demographic changes, particularly in the U.S., and how both actual changes in people's communities and in the nation overall, as well as perceptions of those changes that might be a bit outdated, are associated with a number of outcomes. So some of the things that scholars have looked at are intergroup bias, racial identification, preferences for a range of different social policies, and then finally and relatedly, political ideology, partisanship, and vote choice, particularly in the most recent election.
I'm going to be talking about what I see as really new lines of racial exclusion, class exclusion in the United States that have emerged over the last 30 or 40 years in the context of quite fundamental changes in criminal justice policy. And so why would changes in crime policy be relevant to a discussion of ethnicity, nationalism, and democratic futures? And so what I want to argue to you in my 15 or 20 minutes is that what we've seen with this change in crime policy in the United States is the emergence of a new kind of racial and economic disadvantage that really amounts to a contraction of American citizenship. And in this sense, I think my topic today is very continuous with the themes that Maria and Andreas were sounding. And when I say that crime policy has produced a contraction of citizenship in America, I mean that citizenship has changed in T.H. Marshall's sense, that social membership has become more narrow. There are a smaller number of people who enjoy full membership in American society as a result of changes in crime policy. And I also mean that citizenship has changed in a classical liberal sense, that for a significantly large group of people in the United States, their relationship to the state has been quite fundamentally altered. And the conceptual starting point for this discussion is the idea of mass incarceration. And this was a term that was originally coined by the sociologist David Garland, writing in the early 2000s. David Garland said that mass incarceration really consisted of two things. First, it was a rate of imprisonment, a rate of incarceration that was significantly higher than historically had been the case, and it was comparatively unusual. So a very extreme rate of incarceration, a very extreme rate of penal confinement in the country. But then he went on and said there was a second part of this definition of mass incarceration, and the second part was that incarceration is so socially concentrated that we're no longer incarcerating the individual, but we're incarcerating whole groups. And for me as a sociologist, this was an utterly intriguing idea. At what point do we go from incarcerating the individual to incarcerating the group? And so in a lot of the work that I've done, I'm trying to come up with empirical markers for this idea that we're incarcerating the group. And the research I'm going to talk about will describe this. And I think as I end up, I think we probably need to reformulate a little bit Garland's idea of mass incarceration, particularly if we're interested in this proposition that the change in crime policy has resulted in a contraction in American citizenship, and as a result, a deterioration in the quality of American democracy as well.